Hi, I'm Ethan. I love muzzleloading, and this is a Joseph Angstadt attributed American long rifle featured in the Kentucky Rifle by Dillin. A note inside the patch box attributes this rifle to Joseph Angstadt and indicates this rifle is featured in Plate 6, Rifle number 3 on page 8 of the Kentucky Rifle by John G.W. Dillin, where it is listed as from the Laidacker Collection and by an unidentified maker. Angstat is listed as taxed in Maxatawny Township in Berks County, Pennsylvania in 1800, and then in 1817 just to the west in Kutztown. A comparison of number 55 on page 164 of Thoughts on the Kentucky Rifle in its Golden Age by Kindig is useful, as that rifle is signed JOS ANG. This rifle features a 54 caliber barrel with a 43 and 1-inch octagon barrel. I'm going to do my best here to showcase this rifle with the abilities that we have here today. I recognize that I might not be the best person to showcase these historic pieces, but I can assure you I'm going to try to do my best. Starting at the buttstock and working our way forward like we do in our customary fashion here, you'll notice just right off the bat that we have a very distinctively shaped buttstock here, and this is iconic for Berks County, Pennsylvania. When you think of a Berks County gun, this is the shape that you're going to see in the buttstock 9 times out of 10, if not more. It's just so prominent and so iconic for that era and for that county specifically, compared to other long rifles from a similar date and even a similar state, and just in Pennsylvania. You see numerous styles and numerous design changes through the years, but this curved drop here, this significant swoop from the height of our bore or our barrel, if you draw that line straight out, this angled drop and this curved swoop that we have down here just screams Berks County. Our butt plate across the top is still pretty wide, much like we see in many of the other Pennsylvania long rifles from the late 18th century. We have 5 facets across the top, and we have a nicked border here at the front of the plate. We have one large screw into the top of our butt plate here in the top center crest, and then we have another down here towards the toe in the back of the butt plate. This butt plate, like I said, there is still fairly wide at the top, but as we jump down to the toe, we drop into just over an inch wide toe on this stock, and accompanying it our toe plate. On the underside here, we have our curved brass toe plate that comes up and is just about in line with the hinge on our patch box on the lock plate side. We have a beautiful border, just kind of a zigzag or wavy lined border. What I love about this border is we can see where the maker started and stopped each section of this border. It wasn't set up and lined out like you would see on a machine where it would start at one end and it would finish at the other. There are moments in here in this border where we can see where the maker has corrected course and has attempted to re-straighten out a line where he got off a little bit. And we can see where, especially here on the edge, on the same side as our patch box, we can see incrementally here 1/2 to 3/4 inch sections where the maker has gotten off the true line and jumped back on. There's just a beautiful handmade human element to a long rifle like this that you just can't get anywhere else. Muzzleloaders of all periods have their grace and have their beauty, but there's something about a rifle like this that has features that aren't just stunningly perfect. This was made by somebody who knew how to do it, but they weren't a machine, and I think that's just something delightful about a piece like this. The front end of our toe plate here shifts from this rectangle into a pointed triangle down here. And another note of human touch here, the borders that jump into the triangle are offset a little bit by about a 1/16 of an inch on either side. Just kind of a fun little note. Again, that human touch on this toe plate. The toe plate is held in with 3 nails or tacks, one at the front, one at the rear, and one just off center. Between the off center tack or nail and the rear tack or nail, we have our patchbox release button down here. It looks to be iron and has seen some wear. It's not super polished to a high grit sandpaper like we would think of, but it is worn a little bit. That kind of gives me the idea this has been used and actuated a few times, which I find interesting and neat as usual. Rotating up here so that you can check out this patch box. Again, a beautiful Pennsylvanian patch box. We have 2 sides, our front finial and the box itself. So we have a multi-piece patch box here. Very classic for what we're used to in the American long rifle. You'll notice this is going to be a little bit different than other patch boxes, especially earlier patch boxes. We start to see these motifs of these large flowing shapes come in the late 18th century. And around here, around these sides, we just kind of have a cultural or artistic shift from some of the earlier patch box fins that we see. So we have these large swoops, these kind of basic floral finials here towards the front end of the patch box. Like many of the inlays and hardware that we see on this era of American long rifle, this brass is very thin. It's thin enough to be functional and usable, but compared to what we see in a lot of materials today for contemporary builds or contemporary supplied parts, it seems rather thin. I'm going to activate our patch box lid here. Our patch box still springs up, which I think is a neat detail on something this old. On the inside, we have a very typical patch box release and catch here. Our release back here is just directly tied into our button. Actuating the button in pushes the release up, releasing the catch on the inside of our patch box. And a spring towards the hinge end of the box pushes our lid open. Inside of our patch box here, we have the note from the collection owner with the attribution that has been assigned to this rifle. The patch box itself is fairly rectangular in shape, and as usual here, we have a patch box interior that has not been finished or stained. We can assume maybe that some oil could have been applied to the patch box early on and has since dried or evaporated over time, but when you compare the color and the richness of the finished stock here on the outside to the inside almost looks like worn barn wood. If you've ever seen an old barn up close, from this same era, if you're lucky, the wood's going to look very similar. It's not been treated, and it just looks like old wood. I mention that because it's asked a lot in terms of, and when asking about contemporary builds and contemporary muzzleloading, if the inlets need to be treated. And more often than not, I think I've seen one original long rifle in my experience, albeit limited, that had finished or polished or oiled inlets into the wood. But more often than not, we see it like this, where that wood appears to be bare. Coming forward from our patch box here, we have some beautiful incised carved lines here as our crest folds into the wrist. These lines are just beautiful. They're just right, I think. When you look at an American long rifle and you look at the incised carving lines, it's just a really wonderful little space here that the maker has applied these lines to. It makes sense compositionally, because typically here when we come into our wrist area, there isn't a whole lot being done, but we have this shape and this form flowing off of the crest, and we have that motion continued into these incised lines where that energy is kind of dispersed forward through the wrist and back through the buttstock, where we can reunite with our patch box and follow the curves and lines of it. Moving forward from that incised line carving on the wrist, we have a silver oval escutcheon on the top of the wrist here. What's interesting about this is it has a simple border on the outside. It's held on with a single tack or nail in the center. And around that tack or nail in the center, we have engraved another oval with some lines going out from the oval lines, It makes it look like an eyeball, which I find to be rather interesting. So many times when we think about this era of art creation, we think of it being very refined, very artistic. But something like putting an eyeball on here is a little bit curious. It's a little bit odd, and I think it shows maybe a little bit of the creativity of the maker in what we believe to be the early 1800s. Much like the incised carving line in the wrist, we have a similar scroll pattern coming off of the tang of our barrel back here behind our lock. This is, again, a very common place to have some carving, but unlike earlier long rifles where we see more three-dimensional relief carving, these incised lines are pretty flush with the stock, and again, help pull our eye from the tang and the lock region back through the wrist, where we can further enjoy the composition. The tang is very typical for an early American long rifle, especially early 1800s and before. The incised line coming around the rear of our mortise terminates in kind of a flowing scroll pattern and is picked up again on the underside. As we come around the front of the lock plate mortise, though, we have some more reliefed carving here where the lock mortise is separated from the rest of the stock in dimension rather than incised line carving. The lock mortise itself shows some gaps here at the rear, but the lock itself looks to be in good shape. We can actuate the cock slightly. Our frizzen and our frizzen springs are still functional. What's interesting here is we have a touch hole that I would say is rather appropriate for the era. So many times we see these have been drilled out over time, but this one looks as if it is still relatively original, at least to my limited experience, again, eye here. Like many original pieces, we have a bit more age around our lock and the barrel and the touch hole here than we see on the rest of the muzzleloader. This is something you see even in today's contemporary builds that have been used quite a bit. You can clean a muzzleloader as much as you want, but there's more often than not, there's going to be some wear in this area. And to me, I appreciate that, especially when we look at an original piece like this. They weren't necessarily cleaning these to a high polish in civilian use all the time. So when we have and we can see some of this wear around the breech section, we can start to think about some of the things that this rifle has seen and maybe who carried it in the woods. The lock plate itself is 4 7/8 inches long and is kind of a classic Ketland style lock with these ribs back here at the tail, and we have a faceted priming pan here at the bottom. There is some slight file work on our frizzen spring here, and we have similar facets emulated on the front of the frizzen. Flipping this around here so you can check out our trigger guard. A very simple brass trigger guard, very appropriate for the period. It's been aged very nicely. Take notes if you are looking to age some brass for your contemporary builds. I believe this trigger guard is held in with 2 pins. One's going to be up towards the front here on this face, on the lock face. It's going to be hidden. We should be able to see it on our side plate side. But then here towards the rear, we can see the pin and the pin hole at the tail of our trigger guard. We have a simple iron trigger plate here with a single trigger. It's a short, fairly wide trigger in this flintlock. As we come forward here away from our lock mortise, the color of the stock lightens up a little bit, similar to that we see back here on the crest where there has been some wear. We have very tight, curly tiger striped lines in the grain here for this stock. And as we come up forward here, we have our simple, very short, once again, rear sight, 9 inches forward of our breech. This rear sight is very low to the top of the barrel. It's been dovetailed in rather tightly. We can see the barrel itself folded or curled up a little bit where the sight was set in. What's interesting here is it's a little hard to tell, but it looks as if this isn't entirely straight into the top of the barrel, which I find just, again, to be delightful. Another human touch on something. An inch or so forward of that, we have the incised line carving that surrounds our entry pipe here. A simple brass entry pipe, rather plain. It looks as if there were facets on this at some point. They have been worn slightly on our entry pipe, but we do have a couple wedding band motifs. On either side here, we have the same style incised line carving that we saw at the tang and at the wrist on this piece. We have some beautiful C scrolls coming off of the carved separation between our forestock and the stock forward here of our trigger guard. These simple scrolls are primarily just outlines. Coming forward around our ramrod channel, we have similar incised line carvings flanking the ramrod channel on either side of the stock. The incised lines terminate just forward of our first ramrod pipe at the fore end of the stock. I personally cannot quite tell if this barrel is swamped or not. I'm leaning towards a full octagon all the way through. Our front sight, much like our rear sight, is very low to the deck of the barrel top face here. The sight itself looks to be brass, and there's just a slight glint on the top rear face of this so that you can see it in the sight picture as you sight down the barrel. Adjusting once again to our side plate side, you can see the copy of the incised line carving flow along the ramrod channel and the sister or brother to the entry pipe incised line carving here as well. We have a slight breakage here on a barrel pin, something that we all hate to see in our muzzleloaders, but it is something that happens. It's just the nature of these original muzzleloaders. I don't think it detracts from this piece. It's still an original piece. And again, for me, having that wear is always fun. It's always interesting. And I can imagine the shooter or the owner cussing a little bit, as I have done whenever you blow out a pin like that. While this is a bit of a later American long rifle, we do still see rather large lock bolt heads on our side plate side here. We have one at the front on the lower bulb of our side plate here, and then we have a larger one here at the center of our lock and our side plate at the top of the side plate. The side plate itself is not entirely flat. It's been inlet into our side plate mortise, but it does have some filed edges here that are set into the side plate mortise, giving it a little bit of dimension here as it rests. I do want to note that it appears that our side plate here is a little bit thicker than the other brass that we see used. I think this was a bit more of a solid chunk or piece of brass applied here rather than the thin sheets that we see elsewhere. Back through the wrist, we pass our eyeball silver escutcheon, and then we have the pair to the wrist incised carving lines that we saw on the lock plate side. On this side, however, these lines have a little bit more context, and it almost feels as if the cheekpiece side incised line carvings are spilling over a little bit through the wrist onto the other side because of how much ornate carving we have here. And again, this isn't the relief carving where we have a lot of dimension and contrast that we see in some of the earlier American long rifles. This is a rather flat with some relief carved area here as we go under our cheek piece. We just have some beautiful scrolls and curves here until we get back to behind our cheek rest, where we have a very traditional C scroll. And then on the top here, more scrolled lines and these circles and sunbursts emanating from this scroll work. Just a beautifully simple application of this carving. So many times I think we grow to know and love the very high contrast relief carving back here, but I think there's something to be said about the simplicity in the lines on this cheek piece carving. In contrast to the incised line carving, our C scroll does have a little bit of dimension separating it from the rest of the stock, but not nearly to the extent that we see in other schools of long rifle building. Our cheek rest itself is fairly shallow. This piece does set well to the cheek when holding it, but we do have a simple incised line coming straight through that cheek piece separation. Very common, very appropriate if you're looking to build something similar. On the top of our cheek rest here, we have a half moon or a crescent moon silver inlay in a little bit of a different orientation than we see in a lot of respects. This half moon shape here, as it's inlaid into the stock, has the main crest of the moon pointing up rather than to the left or to the right. So in some respects, you could say this moon was facing down in contrast to some of the other moons that we see on other muzzleloaders. I know for many of you out there, this piece is iconic and you've probably looked at it for decades in some of the wonderful long rifle books that are out there. I hope that this has done this piece a little bit of justice in showing you some of its up-close detail and some of my appreciation of this beautiful piece. I'd really like to thank the Rock Island Auction Company for allowing me to showcase beautiful muzzleloaders just like this one. If you'd like to see more high quality photos and videos of original antique arms like this one, you can visit the Rock Island Auction Company social media pages to learn more. Once again, I'm Ethan. I love muzzleloading. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you next time.